Well, good morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we continue reading The Bishop Who Ate His Boots with Chapter 5, Part A. By the middle of May 1896, the Stringers set out for their distant post. For Mrs. Stringer, the prospect must have imposed a tremendous strain, approaching the proportions of an ordeal. She was leaving family and friends for life in an unknown country amid a strange people. Before them stretched a long journey, at least half of which would be by unfamiliar means, and with much hardship and difficulty. Her house, when at last she reached it, would be devoid of ordinary comforts, and with only the bare necessities of life. And to all this there was added the realization that she would before long become a mother. With the faith and courage which were her strength, and which were to stand her in such good stead in the years to come, Sadie Stringer cheerfully bade farewell to her family and friends as they assembled at the railway station to see them off. More than 50 people were there, and as the train pulled out, their handkerchiefs could still be seen waving in the distance. The journey was pleasant and uneventful. They had with them Frederick Fewelling, whom Stringer had recruited for the Bishop of Selkirk, and who traveled with them to Winnipeg, and William D. Young, an uncle of Mrs. Stringer, who had volunteered to go with them as a lay helper. His assistance in their Arctic mission proved invaluable. There were the usual stops at Winnipeg and Calgary, and then they boarded the train for the last stage of the railway journey to Edmonton. At Wetaskiwin, about 40 miles from their destination, Stringer was surprised to receive a telegram from the conductor. It was from his brother Will, and contained the sad message, quote, May 24th. Mother died suddenly today. Burial Tuesday, unquote. It was a great shock and saddened them as they reached Edmonton. So far from home and so helpless to offer comfort or consolation to the other members of the family. On the day of the funeral, they sat together in their room at the Queen's Hotel and read the solemn yet hopeful words of the burial office. They were somewhat comforted on the following morning when they received a further telegram. This one was from George Stringer and read, quote, Mother died suddenly, 6:30 in chair. Last words, quote, the Lord be praised, unquote, unquote. In Edmonton, there were supplies to be purchased and arrangements to be made to have them transported to Athabasca Landing. It is difficult to learn very much about their financial situation. The annual reports of the Canadian Church Missionary Association for this period suggested that the Stringers were completely maintained by them and received an annual stipend of $650. After a crowded 3 days, they left for the north with a wagon train on a rainy day at the end of May. It was late afternoon when they set out, and after pausing for tea between 7 and 8, they stopped 3 hours later and camped for the night near the Sturgeon River. For the next 2.5 days, they covered about 40 miles a day until they reached Athabasca Landing. Here, they were the guests of the Bishop and Mrs. Young. The Bishop had been there since the previous fall and was now making plans for the building of a church. The day after their arrival, the Stringers boarded the Athabasca for the next stage of their journey to the head of the Grand Rapids. At that point, there was some delay as they waited to get their trunks and supplies taken from the steamer to the lower end of the portage. They had 16 pieces of luggage when they left Toronto, to say nothing of the year's supplies which they had bought in Edmonton. For 2 or 3 days they camped in more or less comfortable fashion on the island. They made their way to the lower end of the portage, then journeyed in a small boat down the Athabasca River to Fort McMurray, where they boarded the Graham. They reached Smith's Landing on June 22nd and prepared to undertake another 16-mile portage over muddy trails cut through the brush. The Stringers set out with 2 other passengers, but the driver took a wrong trail and the wagon got stuck fast in deep mud. The horses simply lay down and had to be unhitched. The missionary carried his wife on his back to the other side of the impasse, then assisted in trying to pull out the wagon. Wading all the time knee-deep in water and mud, an ox cart which came along helped them onto firm ground. It was fun for those looking on, Mrs. Stringer commented afterwards, and I could hardly hang on without laughing. When the Wrigley arrived from the north, it brought Bishop Reeve and J.S. Camsell. The bishop was going out for the seasons of the General Synod at Winnipeg and would return to Fort Simpson soon afterwards. For 10 days they remained at Fort Smith, and on July 3rd the steamer left again for the north, carrying the Stringers with her. After calling at other ports down the river, they reached Fort McPherson after a 43-day journey north from Edmonton. As her husband had done for years previously, Mrs. Stringer viewed her new home with a great deal of interest and not a little apprehension. She looked at the Indians and Eskimos and at the handful of whites and listened to the noise of conversation, most of which she could not understand. As soon as the steamer tied up, Whittaker came aboard to meet them. He took them ashore in a whaleboat and up the high bank of the river to the mission. Here they met the patriarchal archdeacon and his family. All the Indians and Eskimos crowded around to shake hands with the newcomers for about a half an hour. They had supper with the archdeacon about midnight, and finally retired to bed between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. The next day was filled with excitement, and for a little while Sadie Stringer felt lost. Everyone was busy with letters and stores. At the mission house, the archdeacon and his family were packing up to leave in the steamer as they went out on furlough. To make matters worse, the mosquitoes were unusually bad. The steamer had arrived on Friday. On the following Sunday, Stringer spoke to the Eskimos at their services, and the archdeacon gave a farewell message to the Indians. The steamer left the next day carrying the MacDonalds and also the Hodgsons, who were moving to Fort Simpson. The Stringers began to plan in earnest for the future. The missionary was busy picking up threads of his work after a year's absence. Mrs. Stringer was busy trying to make the mission house seem more like home. The next move was, as had been for Stringer himself 4 years before, for the missionaries to go among the Eskimos. A fortnight after their arrival, Stringer and his wife, accompanied by Whittaker, sailed down the Peel River into the Mackenzie. They traveled in the whaleboat which had been given to Stringer at Herschel Island. The mosquitoes were bad and occasioned them all a good deal of discomfort, but Mrs. Stringer especially found them trying. After 4 days of sailing, rowing, drifting, and camping, they came to Kizigaz. They went at once to the council house and shook hands with the 20 men they found there, including Kokolik, the chief. After this exchange of greetings, Mrs. Stringer gave them a present of tea and sugar for all. Then the tents were erected and the missionaries unpacked and did what they could to establish themselves. They found that nearly all the Eskimos were ill with la grippe. They complained of feeling sore in body and of bones, and there was much coughing, spitting, and sneezing. Whittaker looked after the medicine chest, and his cures were in constant demand. The whale hunt had begun just before their arrival, and was not too promising. Up to that point only 21 whales had been killed, but the catch improved during the following weeks, and on a single day they killed 20 whales. As often was convenient, services were held in the council house, and the Eskimos were visited in their tents. Sometimes the children and young people were gathered together for lessons in singing and reading. Mrs. Stringer sang hymns to them, greatly to their delight. One rather serious incident occurred which could have had fatal results. A bottle of whiskey was obtained from a whaling ship. The chief, Kokolik, obviously intoxicated, came and sat by Stringer asking for a pipeful of tobacco, at the same time asserting loudly and hoarsely that he was not drunk. He then handed the bottle containing perhaps a spoonful of whiskey to Whittaker, who promptly poured the contents on the ground. Seeing this, the chief became very enraged and seized the bottle from Whittaker's hand. With 2 mighty swings across the fire-pole, he smashed it to pieces. Asking him why he did this only fanned his rage, and he stormed away, ferociously ordering the missionaries to leave and never return. As he was about to leave, the chief's wife appeared and attempted to pacify him, but this only increased his fury. Until this time, his anger had been directed against the missionaries generally, but now he vented all his wrath upon Whittaker. "I'm not afraid of you," he said threateningly as he edged up to him. "I'm not afraid of you either," said Whittaker. "We'll settle this with knives," said the Eskimo. "No, we won't," replied the other. "Guns then," said Kokolik. and with that he pushed his way into Whitaker's tent, seeking to grab his rifle. A struggle followed, the tent fell down. Whitaker threw his arms around the chief and held him. Meanwhile, the Eskimo removed his labret, a whalebone ornament thrust through his upper lip in the form of a mustache, and gave it to his wife, and struggled to get free. While these attempts to calm him proved to be in vain, Stringer called to men who were standing and watching from the council house about 100 yards away. For a moment there followed tense silence. Would they support the missionaries against the chief? If they did not, what would happen? Slowly they moved toward the tents, and greatly to Stringer's relief, they took hold of Koklik and carried him away. During the excitement, Mrs. Stringer had gone into her tent, and had hurriedly gathered up all the knives and guns she could see. Then she hid them under the bedding and sat on them. She was in this position when one of the Eskimo women came in to comfort her, and to assure her that neither she nor her husband were the objects of Koklik's fury. About 5 minutes after the disturbance, Koklik and his son-in-law, the young chief Takochakina, came back alone. The older man was, by this time, exceedingly subdued, and assured the missionaries that he had nothing but the friendliest of feelings towards them. After a little while he inquired of Whitaker, expressing kindly feelings for him as well. However, since Whitaker had been the occasion of the chief's outburst, it was thought he should remain out of sight until the chief was sober. Many Eskimos showed sympathy for the missionaries in their ordeal, and were anxious to know whether they would come back in the following year. Stringer spent the rest of the day visiting the Eskimo tents, and that evening he and Whitaker conducted a service in the council house, at which 45 Huskies were present. The missionaries remained for another 3 weeks after the liquor incident, going in and out among the people as though nothing had happened, and being well received by them. On the morning of their departure, the chief himself showed his goodwill by paying them a social visit and expressing the hope that they would return soon. From Kittigazit, the party traveled across the delta to the Mackenzie, to Shingle Point and Herschel Island. This was not altogether a pleasant holiday outing. When the weather was warm, the mosquitoes were plentiful. Often it rained, and once the tent was blown away by the wind at 3 o'clock in the morning. For the last stage of their journey from Shingle Point, they had to steer their way carefully through several large ice floes. When they reached Herschel Island on the 25th of August, the whaling ships had already assembled, and for the next few weeks the missionaries were fully occupied. They lived in the sod house which Stringer had purchased before going on furlough, and spent their time visiting both the Eskimos and the officers and men of the ships. Sunday services were held in the whaling company's house on the island, and the Eskimos were gathered together whenever possible for instruction. The coming of the whaling fleets had made considerable differences in the Eskimos' way of life. Now they tended to work on the ships during the summer, and to spend the winters in idleness. Material for building a mission house had been sent from San Francisco in response to Stringer's request, but it was not thought advisable to proceed with the building because of the uncertain future. Commercial fishing had been poor, and few whales had been caught in the Arctic waters during the past few years. If the decline continued, it was almost certain the ships would cease to winter at Pauline Cove, and many Eskimos would leave. For the present, however, there was splendid opportunity for evangelic work. About the middle of September 1896, the missionary party started on the return journey, taking with them an additional whaleboat intended for Tom Marsh at Hay River. Visits were paid along the way to Shingle Point and other Eskimo settlements and families along the coast, until by the end of the month, in the nick of time, the travelers reached the delta of the Mackenzie. It was not a moment too soon, for on the night of September 25th, a terrific gale swept along the coast. Snow fell heavily, lakes and shoals were frozen over, and 3 of the ships bound for winter quarters at Herschel Island were icebound along the coast. Although in relative safety, Stringer and his party were still 100 miles from home and could not afford to delay. During the worst of the storm, they found shelter for the night where some Indians were camped. For the next 3 days they had fair wind, and it seemed that they might expect to reach home safely. When they were only 15 miles from Fort McPherson, the ice ran thick in the river, making travel difficult. At 10 o'clock one night they got ashore with some difficulty and made camp. It was a trying experience, especially for Mrs. Stringer, but in her native deerskin costume she was at least more comfortable than she had been on the outward journey when plagued by mosquitoes. The next morning it was clear that any further progress by boat was out of the question, and the boats were unloaded and hauled ashore. This operation took most of the day, and the party camped that night on a spot directly across the river from their previous camp. After breakfast the following day, Whitaker and one of the men set out for the fort, traveling light, while the Stringers followed more slowly, carrying the essential parts of their luggage with them. Dusk came, and they made camp for the night, hoping that the next day would see them safely back at the mission. And we'll stop there for this week. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 5, Part B. Until then, take care, stay safe.